She was born into a world where softness meant danger, and silence meant survival. Her name was Koda, but no one ever used it. To her captors, she was just another trophy in waiting, a heartbeat trapped in a cage of fear. When rescuers finally broke through the gates of an illegal hunting camp, what they found wasn't just an injured animal, but a shattered soul. Curled into the shadows, eyes wide with terror, teeth bared in desperation. She didn't attack because she was wild. She attacked because it was the only thing that had ever kept her alive. And then, a woman walked in, not with force, but with silence. And what happened next would defy everything science knows about trauma, trust, and the healing power of presence. The hunters had already left. Their footprints were fading beneath the early morning mist, but the silence they left behind was deafening. At the far edge of the illegal hunting camp, beneath a collapsed tarp and broken crates, lay something that barely resembled a living creature. Koda. His fur was tangled with mud and dried blood. His body, curled so tightly into itself, looked like he was trying to disappear. Not out of cunning, but from pure fear. The Bobcat had been locked away in that place for years, treated not as a living soul, but a trophy in waiting, growled at, starved, punished for being wild. When the rescue team found him, he didn't lunge or run, he just trembled. His eyes, wide and glassy, were those of an animal who'd forgotten what the world outside a cage looked like. The volunteers approached gently, but Koda's reaction was instant. A flash of teeth, claws raised, snarling not out of aggression, but terror. A scream for help from a heart that no longer knew how to ask for it. This wasn't just a physical rescue. Koda was shattered inside, and yet, beneath all that trembling, there was a pulse. Faint, but alive. The question was, could anyone reach it? Because that's when Clara arrived. And instead of trying to fix Koda, she chose to sit with his brokenness. Clara Thompson didn't walk into the enclosure like most people would. She didn't carry tools, restraints, or even food at first. Just a thermos of warm tea and a thick wool blanket, which she laid gently on the opposite side of the fence. Then she sat and stayed. Hours passed. Koda didn't move. His gaze flicked between her and the gate, ears twitching, chest still heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. He wasn't used to silence that didn't hurt. He wasn't used to eyes that didn't demand anything from him. Clara knew the language of wounded animals, but she also understood something far more rare, the weight of unspoken survival. She didn't try to speak to Koda with words. She spoke with presence, with patience, with stillness. Each day she returned, always the same way, slowly, without expectation. She never crossed the invisible line he had drawn, not until he allowed it. And then, it happened. Not with a dramatic gesture, but with the gentlest of shifts. Koda's paw, hesitant and trembling, reached toward the raw meat Clara had laid out, just a few feet closer than before. He didn't take his eyes off her as he ate. For the first time, his survival wasn't about fear. It was about trust. Tentative, fragile, but real. Clara didn't celebrate. She simply exhaled, her eyes moist with quiet awe. That moment wasn't just progress. It was sacred. Day by day, inch by inch, something began to bloom between them. Koda stopped retreating to the corners. He began to listen when Clara's voice filled the air with soft, reassuring tones. When she read aloud, poetry sometimes, his ears would perk up. It was as if some ancient part of him remembered what it felt like to be safe, to be heard. There was no sudden transformation, only the slow unfolding of a soul long kept in chains. And every time Clara left the enclosure, she whispered the same thing under her breath: "You're not alone anymore." But there was one moment, subtle, almost imperceptible, that marked the true beginning. The day Clara extended her hand, and Koda didn't flinch. He didn't touch it. He didn't run. He just stood still. And that stillness after years of torment meant everything. Because in the silence of that moment, something shifted. Not just in Koda, but in the course of his entire story. And the next day he took a step that no one expected. In the beginning, Koda's progress felt like watching ice melt in moonlight. Slow, almost invisible, but undeniably happening. Each morning, Clara would enter the enclosure with the same calm rhythm. No sudden movements, no forced gestures, just consistency, the kind that broken hearts often crave but rarely believe in. And Koda, with his storm-worn spirit, started to change. At first, it was subtle. He stopped flinching when she walked near. His eyes, once wide with panic, began to soften. His ears, always alert like the prey he'd been turned into, finally rested. The tremors in his legs faded. Then one morning, Clara extended her hand with a small piece of cooked rabbit, and Koda, almost as if in slow motion, leaned forward and accepted it. From her fingers, no growl, no retreat. It was more than hunger. It was surrender, not to a person, but to a possibility. A possibility that not every human hand meant harm. From that day on, their bond deepened like roots threading through soil. Clara spoke softly, often not about Koda, but to him, like he was listening. And somehow, he was. When she sat cross-legged near the cedar post he favored, Koda would come rest nearby, close enough that she could feel his breath on her skin. And then came the moment that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. She had been reading aloud, a passage about forgiveness, about the quiet return of trust, when Koda walked up to her, lowered his head, and gently pressed it against her chest. She froze, not out of fear, but reverence. Her hand rose slowly, resting on his neck. His heartbeat, wild, steady, alive, thumped against her ribs. For that instant, there were no cages, no memories of pain, no difference between species. There was only connection, the kind that doesn't need explanation, the kind that can heal things even time couldn't touch. Tears slipped down Clara's cheeks as she whispered, "You chose this. You chose me." That day, she didn't take notes. She didn't report his progress. She simply sat in the enclosure long after Koda had returned to his shaded corner. Her hands still remembering the weight of his head, her heart forever altered. But even as trust bloomed, Clara knew she couldn't keep him. And soon, she would have to teach him how to leave. Clara had always known the truth. Love, the real kind, doesn't cling. It releases. And as Koda grew stronger, more confident, more alive, she felt it coming. Freedom. But freedom wasn't just about opening a gate and watching him run. It had to be earned by both of them. Koda needed to remember what it meant to be wild, and Clara needed to learn how to let go without breaking. The preparation began in silence, like a ritual. They built a large outdoor habitat that mimicked the forest. Logs, brush, open space. Simulated prey was introduced, and for the first time, Koda stalked, leapt, and caught with a focus that awakened something ancient in him. His body remembered. More importantly, his spirit did too. Clara monitored everything, his instincts, his strength, his emotional responses. But every time he looked back at her between those training sessions, it was as if he was asking, "Will you still be there when I leave?" The day the GPS collar was fitted around his neck, Clara's hands trembled. Not because she doubted his readiness, but because, for the first time since she'd met him, she was no longer needed. And that's the paradox of real rescue. Healing means you're not the center of the story anymore. When the gates opened, the forest waited like an old friend with open arms. The air was cool, alive with the sound of birds and distant water. Koda stepped out slowly, then paused. He looked back, just once. Their eyes met through the morning light, and no words were spoken. None were needed. In that brief moment, everything passed between them. Gratitude, sorrow, courage, and release. Then he ran, not out of fear, not into hiding, but with purpose. Every muscle stretched toward destiny, every stride pulling him closer to the life he was born to reclaim. Clara stood there, alone now, but she didn't cry. She smiled, hands clasped over her chest as the trees swallowed him whole. In the weeks that followed, the GPS pings confirmed it. Koda had settled near a river bend deep in a protected forest zone. His movements were stable. He hunted successfully. He avoided human settlements. He was thriving. But it wasn't until the spring thaw that the final message arrived. A wildlife camera captured something unexpected. Not just Koda, but others, smaller ones, eyes bright, paws clumsy, following their father. Koda stood at the edge of a forest clearing, sunlight streaming through the trees like threads of gold. And behind him, weaving in and out of his shadow, were two tiny bobcats, his cubs. Clara stared at the footage in silence. For a long time, she said nothing. Her hand hovered above the pause button, but she couldn't press it. Something about that frame, that frozen moment, felt like the closing chapter of a sacred book. The story that had begun in a cage, now written across branches and soil and bloodlines. Koda hadn't just survived. He had built something, a legacy. And Clara wondered, as any caretaker would, what pieces of their time together had lingered in his bones. Would his cubs inherit that quiet gentleness he had once offered her in the enclosure? Would they know, even if only instinctively, that not all humans destroy? There was no way to know for sure. But maybe, just maybe, healing leaves echoes. Sometimes they're passed down not in words or actions, but in the rhythm of a heartbeat that once trusted the impossible. And Koda had done something nearly impossible. He had come back from a place where most don't. From terror, from abuse, from complete emotional collapse. And in that journey, he had rewritten his story from victim to father, from captive to teacher. The forest became his sanctuary, but it also became his voice. Every path he marked, every cub he guided. It was all part of something bigger than rescue. It was redemption. And Clara, though no longer part of his daily life, still felt him. In the early morning wind, in the rustle of leaves, in the way she paused sometimes, hand over her heart, remembering the quiet weight of his head resting there. She didn't need to see him again to know he was all right. Sometimes love means disappearing from someone's life, so they can finally live. But deep down, she hoped that one day, long from now, one of Koda's cubs might stumble upon the scent of a woman who once waited in silence and feel safe without knowing why. How many animals, right now, are living in silence, waiting for someone to simply see them? Koda's story isn't just about rescue, it's about resilience, about the invisible scars we carry and the rare souls who choose to stay patiently until healing begins. Clara didn't save Koda with medicine or force. She saved him by being there, by listening to what most would ignore. And maybe that's the kind of gentleness the world needs more of. Have you ever felt like Koda? Frightened, unseen, unsure if kindness was real? Or maybe you've been Clara, choosing patience when others chose control. If stories like this move you, they're not just tales, they're truths, and they deserve to be shared. If you also believe that real connections between humans and wild animals can transform lives, subscribe. These stories need to be heard.